that was a colonial device to prevent people from getting malaria. So quinine was exquisitely effective in killing the malaria parasite. And then during the Second World War, when the German allies, the Japanese, overran the cinchona plantations in Indonesia and places like that, which was the cinchona tree is the source of quinine. When the German allies, the Japanese, overran the plantations, the British and Americans had to look for another source of anti-malaria, and that is where they came across, from the archives, chloroquine, which had already been synthesized but was abandoned because it was too toxic. Chloroquine became the most effective, safest in many ways, although it had some certain side effects, but it was the safest and most effective treatment for malaria. Because one course of treatment that lasted maybe 2 or 3 days, the malaria was cured. And then, but maybe 15 years, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, people began to notice that the malaria parasite was developing resistance to chloroquine. It started in the Far East, in places like Cambodia and Thailand. That's where the resistance to chloroquine began. It also was contributed, the resistance was contributed to by human beings, because some people thought if chloroquine is so effective in the treatment of malaria, we might as well protect the whole population by adding it to table salt. So some people in Brazil added chloroquine to table salt to be used nationally so that everybody can be protected from malaria. But the point about that is that if you add small amounts of chloroquine to the system, the malaria very easily becomes adapted to its presence, and that's adding to the emergence of resistance. So chloroquine resistance emerged, which has now, as I'm talking now, chloroquine is virtually useless in the treatment of malaria, because virtually every strain of the parasite, everywhere you go, has become chloroquine resistant. And there's something else about chloroquine resistance. If a chloroquine resistant parasite emerges, it displaces the sensitive parasite. So it's a matter of time, as soon as malaria resistant to malaria, parasite resistant to malaria occurs in the population of parasites, it's a question of time before all the parasites become resistant to chloroquine. It spreads. There's another thing about it. The resistant parasite is more virulent. That is to say, the disease caused by the resistant parasite is more deadly than the ordinary parasite that's not resistant. Point number one. Point number two, if the parasite becomes resistant to chloroquine, it also usually becomes resistant to other drugs that are used in the treatment of malaria. So as malaria parasite became resistant to chloroquine, it soon became resistant to things like Fancida, mefloquine, camoquine, and all the other drugs that were conventionally used in the treatment of malaria. Once you excite the organism to switch on the resistance mechanisms, it's capable of making other related compounds impotent. You can't use them to treat it. The new drug that is now used, supposed to be effective in the treatment of malaria, is artemisinin. Artemisinin is a drug that was extracted from a Chinese herb. Artemisinin annua is a traditional drug used in the treatment of fever in China thousands of years ago. But a few decades ago, they were able to extract this active component from it. And it's now the drug of choice in the treatment of malaria. Talking about Nigeria specifically, when the Minister of Health determined that chloroquine was no longer a useful drug, was no longer the first-line drug for the treatment of malaria. The Minister of Health determined that the first-line drug treatment for malaria in Nigeria now should be artemisinin or artemisinin combination therapies. In other words, you combine artemisinin with some other things. You can even combine artemisinin with chloroquine or camoquine or other drugs. Queens. Yes. So that because the mechanism, the way artemisinin works is different from the way the other queens work, then the combination will prevent the appearance of resistant organisms. This is a well-known principle in chemotherapy, that if an organism becomes resistant to one drug that is used to kill it, if you introduce another drug that works by a different mechanism, the combination of those two drugs will kill the organism, and the organism will find it difficult to develop resistance to the combination. That's well-known principle in chemotherapy, and it's worked in malaria, in bacterial chemotherapy, cancer chemotherapy, viral chemotherapy. It's worked all along. So now, the combination of drugs to treat malaria is artemisinin plus another drug, what they call ACT, artemisinin combination therapy. Now, what do we find? We are finding now that resistance to the combination therapy is occurring already. It's already occurring from the same area where the chloroquine resistance started, Cambodia and Thailand. And it's spreading. In Nigeria itself, people are beginning to notice that this ACT is not working as well as it should. Let me say something else about the combination therapy that is making it liable to lead to parasite resistance. One is that the dose schedule is more complicated than chloroquine was. Chloroquine, before, you took so many tablets at once, then you took another tablet, and then you took another tablet. In 2 days, the malaria was cured. But ACT is a 5-day therapy. And it's expensive, extremely expensive for the ordinary Nigerian to afford. So you have a combination of an extended dose schedule, which is difficult for Nigerian. Nigerian people are notoriously non-compliant. You give them a prescription for a drug, they buy the drug, they take it for a few days, they feel better, they abandon the therapy. That's well known to be the case among Nigerian population. So if you don't complete the course of treatment, you leave some parasites that have not been killed becoming resistant to the therapy. All right? You understand that? Mm. And those ones that are now partially resistant to the therapy will grow and give rise to a population of other parasites that are equally resistant. So a dose schedule that is difficult and complicated
and expensive.
Expensive is another thing, because some people will say, I can't afford the 15 tablets you're asking me to buy for this illness, can't I buy 5? And some unscrupulous chemists say, all right, if 5 is what you can pay for 5 and go and treat yourself. So inadequate therapy, non-compliance, a combination is deadly and favorable for the emergence of resistant organisms. So what I'm trying to say is that in time, this ACT will become useless for the treatment of malaria. We'll have to, in fact, already the pharmaceutical companies are already looking for other potent drugs. So my warning is that if we go on from one potent, expensive drug to another, we're going to get to the point where we reach the stage where we reach with tuberculosis, where drugs are no longer effective. And it's us in Africa who are living with malaria that will suffer. That's a warning.